Well, good evening, everyone. I'm Jackie Miller, the President and CEO of the World Affairs Council in Seattle, and it's my pleasure tonight to welcome you to this evening's discussion on the policy and politics of the Iran nuclear agreement with Joe Cirincione, Trita Parsi, and Reşat Kasaba. This discussion is presented by Town Hall in partnership with the World Affairs Council, the Plowshares Fund, and the Jackson School of International Studies at the University of Washington. It is also part of Town Hall's Civic Series and the World Affairs Council's Rapid Response Series. And it certainly fits in the Rapid Response Series. It's a very, very timely event. We are exactly 1 month removed from the formal adoption of the Iran nuclear agreement. This agreement was a result of years of negotiations between Iran and the P5+1, and then took some pretty heavy lifting at the end to actually get the agreement through the US Congress. The other administrations had a little easier lift than the US, but the administration got it through, and we are now going to be able to talk about what this agreement is going to look like in practice. The onus initially is going to be on Iran in terms of fulfilling its end of the bargain in order for the West to fulfill its end of the bargain, which is delivering on sanctions relief. There is an awful lot at stake tonight, and this is a really, really significant agreement. So to discuss this, we are going to have an initial conversation with our very well-placed panelists, and that's going to be about 45 minutes. And after 45 minutes, we're going to turn it over to you for your questions. You'll see that we have microphones on either side of the stage. So once Rashad gives you the indication that it's time for your questions, if you could come up to the microphones, actually speak right into them, because the event is being recorded for archival purposes, and we want to make sure that we know what the questions are that the panelists, or to which the panelists are responding. Now I'm going to quickly introduce our speakers tonight so we can get right to the discussion. I'm going to start from the left, my left, your right, with Joe Cirincione, who is the president of the Plowshares Fund, which is a global security foundation that works to reduce the threat from nuclear weapons, ideally by getting rid of them. So he's very proud of the agreement and what Plowshares has accomplished. He's a member of Secretary of State John Kerry's International Security Advisory Board and a longtime member of the Council on Foreign Relations. He previously served as the Vice President for National Security and International Policy at the Center for American Progress in DC, and as Director for Nonproliferation at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Dr. Trita Parsi is the founder and president of the National Iranian American Council and the 2010 recipient of the Gromeyer Award for Ideas Improving World Order. He advises Western and Asian governments on foreign policy matters and has many, many, many articles on the Middle East that have been published in little publications you might have heard of, the Wall Street Journal, Nation, New York Times. He's also a frequent guest on the news media, including CNN, PBS, and NPR. Joe's not a slouch himself on that department, appearing frequently on ABC, BBC, and Al Jazeera. Do you guys divide them up ahead of time and decide who gets?
I get the first half of the album.
Right, he gets the second half. And both Joe and Trita are award-winning authors. Joe's latest book is Nuclear Nightmares, Securing the World Before It's Too Late. And Trita's is Single Roll of the Dice, Obama's Diplomacy with Iran, which was named the best book of 2012 on the Middle East by Foreign Affairs. And guiding our conversation tonight is Dr. Rashad Casaba, a professor and director of the Henry M. Jackson School of International Studies at the University of Washington. I think many of us in the room already know Rashad. His research is focused mainly on the modern Middle East, including Turkey. He has written on topics from state-society relations to urban history, and recently published an op-ed in the Seattle Times about the Iran nuclear agreement that I'm sure you all read before coming tonight. Rashad is another award-winning author and an excellent moderator. So since I don't think I really fit on the stage in front of all this brain power, I'm going to turn it over to Rashad, who's going to guide us in our conversation. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Jackie, and thank you for coming tonight, and thank you, both of you, for being with us. The ground rules are our discussion will last until about 8:15, and then we will have a period until 8:40 for Q&A. We have to end this sharp at 8:40, so the time is short. So as you listen to our discussion, please, if you're preparing questions, please prepare questions and not long speeches so that we can get to as many of the questions as possible. The main topic, of course, of our discussion is the Iran agreement, but what happened in Paris last week is in our minds. I'm sure it will come up in the course of our discussion and your questions, and we will be happy to address that as well. So since the time is short, I will start, get right to the point, and I will start with a question to Joe. So my first question is, what is this thing? We know that it is not a treaty. Its full name is Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. So can you tell us what exactly this agreement is about, what it does, and do you think it has enough specifications and checks that will ensure its implementation?
Thank you very much, Rashad, and thank you, Jackie, and thanks to all of you for coming here, or if you're listening to the live stream, for taking the time to listen to this. If all you know about the nuclear agreement with Iran is what you heard during the congressional debate, you probably think this deal is somewhere between catastrophic and barely good enough. I was on the Rachel Maddow show shortly after the deal was announced, and after we talked, she said she thought it was the most significant diplomatic achievement in a generation or more. The New York Times called it potentially the most important national security agreement in decades. The President of the United States went before the United Nations in the end of September and said, this is what it looks like when the international system functions as it should. This is an agreement that was endorsed by dozens of former diplomats and national security advisors, Republicans and Democrats, including Brent Scowcroft and Paul Volcker and Carla Hill. It was endorsed by over almost 3 dozen retired generals and admirals. I signed a letter with 75 other nuclear policy experts, the top people in the world endorsing this agreement. We had 330 rabbis write a letter of support for this. Most of Israel's retired military and intelligence leaders said this was a good deal. The Israeli Atomic Energy Council just a few weeks ago endorsed this as making Israel more secure and as preventing Iran from getting a bomb, and a good deal for Israel. So why are all these people saying this is so good if what you've heard for most of this debate is that it is appeasement, that it is a cave, that it is a sign of the President of the United States' weak-handed approach to national security? The reason is that this deal does what it was intended to do. It stops Iran from getting a bomb. As an extra added bonus, it stops an unnecessary new war in the Middle East. If you remember, 5 years ago, all the talk was about when Israel was going to strike Iran, not whether, and when we would be brought into that conflict. We are not talking about that anymore. We are not talking about an Iranian program on, as Colin Powell put it, a superhighway towards a bomb. This deal arrests the program. It stops it in its tracks, but it does more. It puts it in reverse. For the first time in the 12 years that Iran has been building centrifuges, it is now decreasing its stockpile. The IAEA just came out with a report today that says over 1/4 of Iran's centrifuges have already been taken offline. This is a deal that just went into adoption last month. It's just about a month old now. It was adopted in the middle of October 18th. Just to take 2 more minutes on specifics, what this deal does is it forces Iran to rip out 2/3 of its centrifuges. These are the machines that can enrich uranium for fuel or for bombs. It makes Iran ship out of the country 98% of its stockpile of low enriched uranium gas. That's the stuff you put in the centrifuges. It leaves them with about 300 kilograms. You know what you can do with 300 kilograms of LEU? Squat. You can't make a bomb, you can't make fuel, it's a purely token amount. It makes them take out the core of their plutonium production reactor, the other possible fuel for a bomb, drill it full of holes, and fill it with concrete so they block that path. It shrinks this entire program down to a fraction of what it was before the deal, and then wraps it in the most intrusive inspection regime ever negotiated. I know what you've heard about self-inspections and 24 days. This is by far the strongest inspection regime I've ever seen. This is the strongest non-proliferation agreement I have ever seen. And I've been doing this for 30 years. This is a major diplomatic triumph and advance for U.S. national security. It makes America safer, Israel safer, the region safer. It is a model for how to do this kind of thing in the future. If it wasn't for the partisan politics and the intervention of the Prime Minister of Israel into this debate, this would have been a non-controversial agreement. Outside of Washington, that is the District of Columbia, there was broad acceptance of this agreement. It was only the partisan politics and then the international factor that made this into the controversy that it became.
Thank you. Rita, let me ask you to kind of give us a sense of what it looks like from within Iran. On the one hand, obviously, Iran has a lot to gain from the full implementation of this treaty, especially in terms of lifting of sanctions. But we are at the same time hearing conflicting stories from Iran. Every day there seems to be another statement that denounces either the treaty or the president who signed it. Obviously there is a split in Iran. Can you give us an idea of, as I said, how Iran approached this treaty and what the nature of the split is about?
Thank you. And thank you all for being here, for the World Affairs Council for organizing this. You're asking a very important question. Sorry. You're asking a very important question. And Joe mentioned that it was to a very large extent partisan politics in Washington, D.C. that actually made this issue controversial. I remember talking to a European diplomat asking him, what's the debate like in the EU? And he said, what's there to debate? This is a complete no-brainer. There's nothing to debate. We managed to make sure that there is no war and that there's not going to be an Iranian bomb. There's nothing to debate. In Iran, very similarly, the reason why there has been a pseudo debate is because, again, the partisan politics. Those who stand to lose the most inside of the Iranian political elite are the ones that have been benefiting from the sanctions that have been imposed. They're the ones who have made money off of these sanctions. In fact, it's very interesting what has happened just in the last couple of weeks. As the Iranians started to implement the deal and as we're getting closer and closer to the moment in which sanctions will be lifted, the hardliners in Iran suggested that now we need to impose sanctions on American goods. And they went down and they closed down a shop that had copied KFC, some sort of a fake KFC that existed in Tehran, closed it down as a symbolic gesture. We're not going to let the Americans in. What this does is it reminds us of a very important fact. What the hardliners in Iran have feared all along has not been the sanctions. It's been the lifting of the sanctions. It's been the opening of doors. It's been the presence, not the absence, of America inside of Iran. That's what they're fearing. That's what they're resisting. That's why they're right now arresting people in Iran and doing a backlash, because they actually want to scare away international business. Because they know that if the rest of the world participates with Iran, inside of Iran, in its economy, in its political system, the hardliners are going to lose much of the grip of power that they have. So from their perspective, it has nothing to do with the details of the deal. It's not about whether Iran is going to dismantle 5 centrifuges, too many or too few. It's not about whether that core in Iraq was going to be kept or not. It's about the fear that now they're actually going to have to deal with a globalized world and not be protected by these layers and layers of sanction and isolation that actually has served to protect their grip of power. But for the rest of society, this was also a no-brainer. This was a huge victory. The only place in the world that I think that people actually celebrated the deal by going out and dancing was in Tehran and other cities in Iran. I was hoping there would be some dances taking place in Washington, but I was pretty alone running around twerking somewhere in K Street. But in Iran...
In Seattle, we danced.
You danced in Seattle. Good to hear that. But in Iran, the overwhelming majority of people view this as a victory because, on the one hand, the sanctions would be lifted, which they have paid the highest price for, the ordinary people in Iran. Secondly, a sense that this deal also preserved their dignity. Because at the end of the day, this was a deal based on a real compromise. The United States compromised, the EU compromised, and Iran compromised. This was not a deal in which one side dictated the terms of the other side's capitulation. And this is very important. This is actually the first time since sometime in 1815 that Iran has had a major conflict with the great powers, and the end result was that Iran also won. The first time. In every other major confrontation Iran has had with the major powers since the last 200 years, Iran has ended up losing. For the first time, it's a win-win, in which Iran is keeping what they view as part of their dignity, the fact that they're going to retain a peaceful nuclear program, they're going to have enrichment on their soil, they managed to get the rest of the world to also compromise. And this is big. This is very big for them. But it is not complete yet. There's so many threats left. The hardliners in Iran did not have the power to be able to undermine the negotiations, nor did the hardliners in Washington have that power. But both of them do, unfortunately, in my view, have the power to undermine the implementation of the deal, which could be a path towards seeing the deal collapse altogether. So it's important not to take our eyes off the ball if you believe that this is a good deal and you would like to support it, because there's going to be plenty of new challenges from both sides in order to make sure that this one way or another at some point hits a major bump.
Thank you. I will come back to this towards the end to kind of for us to talk about some of those challenges on both sides, actually. But let me just turn now to foreign policy more specifically, Joe. And so I want to ask two related questions. First is, do you see this deal as the beginning of a realignment in the Middle East? And secondly, do you see this, the way this deal was negotiated and signed, can this be a model for U.S., especially in its dealings with other nuclear nations, but also with the problems in the Middle East around Syria?
So this deal is important in and of itself. It was designed from the beginning to do only one thing, which is to stop Iran from getting a bomb. It doesn't solve our other problems with Iran's human rights record at home, which is atrocious, with its support for Hamas and Hezbollah, for its threats against Israel. It's not a cure for cancer. It's not going to help you shed those unwanted pounds. It only stops Iran from getting a bomb, but that's big enough. Whatever else Iran does in the region, it's not going to have a nuclear weapon backing it up. The bonus is that it also acts as a gateway to other conversations with Iran. This was the issue. We had to resolve this issue. Let me tell you a quick story. I had dinner with the president of Iran, Hassan Rouhani. You ever had dinner with Hassan Rouhani, Trita? Just wondering. No, I didn't think so. So this was in September 2013, just after he'd been elected in June of 13. and had come to the United Nations. And you remember the big deal. It was very exciting. The rumors that he and the president would meet and shake hands. They didn't. That was the phone call he got though. And we were at a small gathering, about 25 American think tank leaders, foundation heads, and he was being challenged on the whole basis. The idea that we were going to have negotiations with Iran on the nuclear issue was already beginning, and it was happening. And he was challenged, and he said, well, why are we just talking about the nuclear issue? Why don't we talk about all the other issues? In the parlance of the day was, why don't we go big for big? Let's solve the whole complex of issues together. And the president said, the history of US-Iran relations is very complex. The table can't bear the weight of all these issues at once. I love the way these guys talk. We have to take a step, and in so doing, build confidence that we can take the next 2 steps, and so on and so on. And both sides have agreed to start with the nuclear. What we didn't know at the time, which we now know, is that there actually had been secret negotiations underway between State Department officials and others on our side and Iranians setting out the terms of the negotiations. And it really was, let's start with this. This was the boulder in the road. This was the issue you had to move in order to get to those other issues, including issues where we have overlapping strategic objectives, where we have the same interests in stabilizing Iraq, defeating ISIS, ending the bloodshed in Syria, stabilizing Afghanistan, ending the drug trade in the region, where the US and Iran might be able to cooperate, not to do each other a favor, because they have a shared objective and they need each other to accomplish that objective. So this nuclear issue becomes a gateway to these other conversations. We don't know if those conversations will succeed, but without resolving the nuclear issue, it was impossible to have. And you see it happening already. Just this weekend, Secretary of State Kerry was negotiating in Vienna with who? The Iranians, Zarif, a man he's now spent 2 years with, Foreign Minister Lavrov of Russia, a man he's also intimately involved in these negotiations. Remember, this was a 7-party conversation involving 6 nations plus the EU on this. And they're talking now about Syria. This is not, can we do this? We don't know, but there's no chance of ending the bloodshed in Syria if you don't involve Russia and Iran. You need them as part of the solution. This is not just some liberal notion. The Plowshares Fund says, Henry Kissinger says this. October 18th in the Wall Street Journal, he says, as long as Iran moderates its behavior in the Middle East, we should be open to a dialogue with Iran. We need Iran to prevent the further collapse of the Middle East. So yes, can it be a gateway issue? Absolutely. Can it be a model for how to get things done? Absolutely.
So, how about from Iran's perspective? Do you? I mean, is this partly depends on the balance of power and the groups that you mentioned who are opposed to this deal from the get-go, but as it is implemented, as we go through these stages, do you see this having an effect on Iran's foreign policy in terms of its relations with Hamas and other groups?
Without a doubt, the potential for some change and some shifts in Iranian foreign policy is there. In fact, we've seen the biggest shift already now with signing this deal. I think we've also seen a significant shift in the posture on Israel, which is very important to understand. If you compare all the vile things Ahmadinejad said during his 8 years, some of it that he said, some of it that was attributed to him or mistranslated, but nevertheless, and compare what Rouhani has said for the last 2 years, there's almost complete silence on Israel from his part, with the exception of 2 tweets wishing the Jewish people worldwide a happy Rosh Hashanah. Now, why is this? It's because the Iranians recognize very well, if you now have made it your priority that you want to resolve this nuclear issue, because the geopolitical context has changed, The United States is no longer seen, and it's not been seen for the last 2-3 years, as the main threat to Iran. They have completely different threats that they see as their main problems. If you want to get that resolved, you recognize that you cannot, A, get it resolved while you continue to have that rhetorical posture vis-a-vis Israel, and B, you cannot sustain that deal and make sure that it's an enduring and lasting deal unless you shift your position on Israel, at least the rhetoric that we've seen so far. But also take a look at where was Iran's profile in Gaza 2014. Very different from what you saw in earlier years. Now, is this going to turn Iran into Switzerland? No, it's not going to turn Iran into Switzerland. Nor is it going to turn the United States into Switzerland, although that would be nice too. But it is going to change. I mean, the main assumption that is erroneous to adopt is to believe that there is a completely static analysis of foreign policy on that end. So essentially, they're inherently just going to pursue one specific path, and there's nothing in their surroundings that could change their incentive structure. Their incentive structure has already changed. And if I could throw out another statistics, the Professor Javad Salehi of Virginia Tech has done a study, and he's identified that currently Iran's middle class is 60% of the population, which is one of the highest in the Middle East next to Turkey. But if this deal goes through, and if this deal leads to the type of sanctions relief that it is intended to lead to, and Iran then has a growth of approximately 5% for the next 10 years, which is not particularly high, mindful of where their economy is right now, Iran will have a middle class that will constitute 85% of that country's population by 2025. That's only 10 years from now. Now, a country that has 85% of its population be part of the middle class, which means that their main concerns is where they're going to do their vacation next year, is not likely to be a country that will pursue very radical policies. It is more likely to pursue status quo policies and seek stability and moderation in its environment. Is there a guarantee? No, but it is more likely that it will pursue that path. So as this changes the environment, as it changes Iran from inside, I think it is reasonable to expect that some aspects of its foreign policy will also change. But it is unreasonable to expect that as a result of this deal, Iran will turn into everything America wishes for. That's not going to happen. Iran is a country that for centuries has been a majority Persian, majority Shia state in a region that is dominated by Sunnis and or Arabs. As a result, even before this regime, the Iranian state looked for Shia populations and minorities in other countries and saw them as the closest thing to some form of a natural ally. And Hezbollah clearly is that. And the interest in Iran for the Shias of Lebanon goes way back. That's not going to change. But does it have to manifest itself in the way that it currently manifests itself in the relationship that Iran has with Hezbollah and the relationship that Hezbollah has with Israel? Yeah. That is what can change, and that's what I think the focus needs to be on.
Yeah. Let me just, can I just
of course.
one thing? Again, from another dinner with Rouhani, he used this phrase, he calls, he writes.
Sometimes he can't sleep.
He can't sleep. Joe, are you awake? He talked about how we have to learn how to manage our differences. And I took that word very seriously. He's a very careful speaker. He didn't say resolve. He didn't say overcome. He talked about manage our differences. We're going to have differences with Iran for a very, very long time. But we have to find a way of managing them the way we found a way of managing them with China, the way we found a way, even during the Cold War, of managing them with the Soviet Union. That's the kind of thing we're talking about. Do they want to manage them? I think they do. Rouhani said that he thought that within 30 years, Iran could become the 10th largest economic power in the world. And a lot of people might agree with that. This is a country rich in natural resources, a vibrant, high middle class with a very high literacy rate. They have an industrial base in this country. Iran is the only country in the Middle East that makes automobiles. You unleash that potential, it could transform the country, it could transform the region, it could transform the geopolitics of the Middle East. That's the kind of thing we're talking about here. And that's why so many people are so hopeful about this deal, so expectant about this deal. Because if you can turn Iran from a problem into part of the solution, into a source of stability for the region instead of a source of instability, you're making history. You're making history. It's not very often we get to see a moment like this. We're on the cusp of one now.
Let me just go back to something you said earlier, which is that this was, in many ways, perfect deal. It is a win-win for the US and for Iran, for the regional powers. And it's unusual that you have all, permanent members of the Security Council, plus Germany and plus European Union, all on this together. Scientists like this, former Israeli intelligence officials like this. So this is really a perfect deal. But despite that, President Obama had to use all the political capital he had in order to get it through, and which of course points to this very difficult division that exists in this country now. So going forward, what do you make of that? I mean, how do you deal with that? How do you prevent that from becoming an obstacle to further deals, further agreements in the future?
You must teach a class on this. It's one of the great tragedies of our present moment in American history that just as we're at the end of the Cold War, just as we resolve perhaps the most deadly conflict we've ever had that threatened not just our own extinction, but the end of human civilization on the planet, just as we sort of win that conflict, the Soviet Union collapses, we go on a process of self-destruction where we start ripping ourselves apart, where we make the greatest strategic blunder in American military history, the invasion of Iraq, a completely unnecessary war that begins this process of the unraveling of the Middle East we're seeing play out, that comes back to strike us, not just in New York, but now in Paris and other countries, and it's not over yet. It's going to get worse. And at that moment, unlike after 9/11, when you saw a national unity, after Paris, you see a national disunity. You see politicians immediately leaping to make political advantage of this. That 31 governors should declare that they will not accept refugees into their states in, 4 days after this tragedy, is a disgrace. To me, it is a betrayal of everything this country is supposed to stand for. And it's not about a real security threat. It's about seeking partisan advantage. And so you saw the President of the United States have to fight this tooth and nail to get this. If he wasn't as dedicated, if his Secretary of State and his Secretary of Energy and his National Security Advisor and the leaders at least of the Democrats in the House and the Senate had not been so dedicated, we wouldn't have got this agreement. Something that is so obviously in our national security interest. It is not a healthy sign. I don't see any. Unfortunately, the politicians involved in this think they benefit from this. You can see it every day. Just turn the news on. They think they're benefiting from this, that their poll numbers go up when they trash the President of the United States. I don't see any sign that this is going to end soon. So what it means is that the American public have to be more vocal, have to be the voices of those of us who want peace and progress and reconciliation and to show respect for the other side in a political debate, have to raise our voices and be as loud and as persistent as those on the other side. If we leave this to the politicians in Washington, we're going to continue the self-destruction of this country. We have to be more involved in this process.
If I could add something.
Of course, yeah.
I completely agree with Joe, had it not been for the dedication and the commitment of the president, of the other actors, because this was a huge political risk that they all took. And the biggest, fastest way to fail was to do it incompletely. And instead they realized that and they were willing to pay the political price. And it was very clear that once the deal struck and the opposing side poured somewhere between $20 and $40 million into TV ads, etc., to destroy it, that there was a lot of concern in the White House. The president organized, I think, what is now the largest telephone conference ever with 10,000 people. And his message was very, very simple. I cannot win this unless the public gets engaged and starts making phone call to Capitol Hill and starts to counter those voices who were seeking to derail this process. And the good news out of all of this is that ultimately it worked. Even though the phone calls may have been more in favor of those who wanted to derail the deal, the public reacted and they started coming into this space. And it has been clear to me now, having been in Washington for almost 15 years, that special interest groups tend to have a hegemonic position on their specific issues as long as the American public writ large is absent from the scene. And the American public cannot be constantly present because we have to care too much about the Kardashians and other things to actually pay attention to these issues. But at specific moments, we can get engaged. And when we do, those interest groups that otherwise are so powerful end up losing. This was very clear in 2013 in August when there was this big fight as to whether to go into Syria or not. And it was interesting because the public was very much against it. Most members of Congress said that they got about 9 phone calls in favor of going in and about 1,000 against. Now, I'm not debating whether it was the right thing or not, but bottom line what's happened was that the public reaction was so strong, so the public beat the White House, the defense industry, and the pro-Israel lobby all at the same time in a decisive victory. And that was because of that presence. In their absence, obviously these interest groups, etc., are going to be very, very powerful. And this is an important thing because I think the most disempowering thing that can happen is for people to think that we actually are powerless and that these interest groups are so powerful we can't do anything about it. They're powerful because we're not playing the game.
So let me, before I turn to the audience, let me just follow up to you with and ask you to kind of look at Iran from a similar perspective. And are there pressures or can there be pressures on these hardliners coming from this vast middle class and educated young people who stand to gain from more relationship with the West and for the successful implementation of this treaty? How does that work in Iran?
It doesn't work that well in Iran, let's put it that way. It is a messy process. If you have something moving 2 steps in the right direction, rest assured at some point there's going to be a step back. And it's important not to focus on the last step, because that can be very disencouraging. The key is to focus on the trend. Right now we're in a step back process. There's a backlash going on in Iran. The hardliners are trying to reestablish their relevance. I don't think they're doing this from a position of strength. They're doing this from a position of weakness. They're arresting people, etc., to remind everyone that they're still there and they can't create problems. They're not capable yet, at least there's no evidence, to be able to derail the process. So what they're doing is essentially trying to regain some of the influence that they have lost. If we just look at it from this very narrow perspective, it looks really bad. It looks as if things are going in the wrong direction. It's not going in the wrong direction as a larger trend. As a larger trend, it's still going in the right direction, but there's going to be steps back, and we're right in the middle of one of those right now. But the Iranian people are the ones that over and over and over again have proven their ability to be able to move the country in a positive direction and away from some of that negativity. Had it not been for the Iranian people, despite what happened in 2009, where the regime beat them and killed them on the streets and stole an election from them, had it not been for the Iranian people in 2013 deciding that despite of what happened 4 years earlier, they actually were going to go and cast their votes, even though it's a very unfair election, even though have a very limited amount of choices that they could choose from, but they nevertheless did, and as a result, Rouhani got to power, and this was a person who brought in a team of people who actually could negotiate and who actually could get things done, and lo and behold, 2 years later, we had a deal. Had Rouhani, and I can tell you, I'm writing a book right now how the negotiations succeeded, and my interviews with folks at the White House have been very clear. Had Rouhani not gotten elected, we would not be here today. And that's because of the Iranian people.
Thank you. So I'm going to ask you now if you have questions to come up to the microphone. And as you do that, let me ask Joe one last question. And you mentioned that this is 1 month from the adoption of this treaty. Can you just give us very quickly the milestones that we should now look forward to going forward?
So Iran is now in the process of dismantling the majority of its nuclear program. When they finish this dismantlement, that's when the sanctions get lifted by the United States and by the European Union and other countries. So you'll be looking for a series of reports from the International Atomic Energy Agency monitoring this progress. They have to verify everything. So the 2/3 of the centrifuges get ripped out, they get put in a warehouse, they get put under seals and cameras and inspections. So you'll see those reports. Watch for those. The Iranians think they can do this very quickly. American experts are more skeptical, but sometime around January, February, March, you might see the conclusion of this process and the sanctions be lifted. In the next couple of weeks, there's also going to be another report from the Atomic Energy Agency on the answers they've gotten to the historic questions of what Iran has done in the past. We call these PMD. These are past activities with possible military dimensions. The evidence isn't conclusive, but it's largely circumstantial, but it's pretty clear Iran was engaged in some nuclear weapons research in the 90s and early 2000s. And our intelligence estimates say that they stopped that around 2003. This process is supposed to get them to sort of own up to it, but it's almost impossible to get a full resolution in this early. What you'll probably see is a report that will indicate some of it has been cleared up, but some questions are still unanswered. It'll be a controversial report, so look for that over the next couple of weeks.
Thank you. Go ahead, please.
Thank you. I lament the fact that you guys didn't really talk about the deal that much, so I was wondering if you could actually take some time to explain how the requirements under the deal compare to the actual requirements for the IAEA for all of the countries that signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, how declared nuclear sites compare to non-declared nuclear sites, and specifically with respect to the 24-day window that you said, we're told that still allows investigators to determine if nuclear activity has been going on in those 24 days. What specific evidence do investigators look to after those 24 days to see that?
Thank you. Go ahead.
Thank you. I didn't want to get in too much detail unless you wanted it. Okay, you want it? Let's go. Yeah, I know. I get it. So every time we do this, we learn from our previous mistakes. The deal that we negotiated with North Korea in 1994 to end that country's plutonium production program was 4 pages long. This deal, 151. It's extremely detailed so that there's no misinterpretation of what's to be done, so, including very specific things about how they remove the centrifuges. They have to take the wiring out and the piping out, how they remove the core of the plutonium production reaction, what exactly they do to it, how much uranium they're allowed to have, what's the enrichment level they're allowed to have, inspection procedures. So you heard Benjamin Netanyahu mock the inspectors, similar to the way that Donald Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney mocked the inspectors before the Iraq War, that they couldn't possibly find the programs that they knew that Saddam Hussein had. So Netanyahu mocks this 24 days, and he says if you're a meth dealer, you can flush the evidence down the toilet in 24 days. You know what happens if you flush uranium down a toilet? You have a radioactive toilet. And if you rip the toilet out, you have a radioactive hole in the ground. It's one of the reasons that so many nuclear policy experts have praised this, why so many nuclear scientists have praised it, is this innovation in the resolution of what we call challenge inspections. For all the declared sites that we know of in Iran, that Iran has declared, cameras, monitors, state-of-the-art fiber optic radio frequency seals. That's all covered. But what about the places that are not covered, where there might be some suspicious activity going on? That's where the 24 days comes in. There's a military base and we think something is happening there. We demand an inspection. Iran says, no, it's a military base. We're not going to let you guys into our military base. We have to go in. No, you don't. Yes, we do. No, you... A process is set up. It's spelled out in excruciating detail in the 151 pages, a resolution process that can take a maximum of 24 days. At the end of that 24 days, if Iran still doesn't let us in, bang. They're brought before the UN Security Council. A resolution is passed. It cannot be vetoed by Russia or China or anyone else. The sanctions are put back in place. The deal is over. So, wait. So this 24 days is a record amount of time. Up till this point in the international nonproliferation regime, there had been no limit on this. We have disputes go on for years. We've been trying to get into some Iranian sites for 10 years. Now, is 24 days too long? Can they scrub the place clean in 24 days? We tested it out. Ernie Moniz, our Secretary of Energy, set up a special site in one of our national labs, intentionally contaminated it with uranium products, and tried to scrub it clean in 24 days. Not even close. You've seen DNA sampling and hair molecules on all the detective shows on TV. That's what it's like. You go in and you find molecules, atoms of uranium that are very difficult to get rid of, and you can detect this for years after this activity is there. So 24 days is a blink of an eye in the inspection world, and most nuclear experts feel very confident that we'll be able to detect any violation of the agreement. This is what the Israeli Atomic Energy concluded, that it is almost certain that we can detect any violation by Iran of this agreement.
Thank you.
I can just add 2 points. When it comes to the possible military dimensions, part of it is to make inspections at a site called Parchin in Iran, in which some activities may have happened 12 years ago. We're confident that we're going to be able to find traces of that. That happened 12 years ago. But over 24 days, there was like a crazy debate in Washington about it.
Yeah.
Second point is, one thing to keep in mind, part of the reason why this is not long enough is because the IAEA also felt that it was important to make sure that the process was thorough and not so rushed that the IAEA actually would end up asking for access and getting access to a bunch of sites that turn out to have no nuclear activities at all. Because if that happens 2, 3, 4, 5 times, the end result is the IAEA loses credibility. So you needed to make sure that this is a credible process, and that if you have to go all the way, it's actually because you have a really strong case, so the IAEA doesn't lose credibility in the process.
Thank you. Go ahead.
I have 3 short questions. The first,
Just take one.
just
Choose
one.
one.
How squeezed were the Iranians and the government because of the sanctions? How bad was it?
Go.
You want to go first?
We have a little difference over this. I think the sanctions really squeezed the Iranian economy. It cut their oil exports in half, for example. They went from 2.3 million barrels a day being exported to 1. The rial, the currency, inflated and lost 60% of its value. It dried up investment. People were not investing in Iran because of this. This was a particularly problematic for the oil and gas sectors, which are now have a huge backlog of infrastructure improvement that they need to make. It's estimated there's at least $150 billion worth of infrastructure investment just to get the oil and gas industry back up and running. It was the economic pressures, in my view, is one of the things that convinced Iran to come to the table, and there was a debate inside the Iranian elite And Rouhani represented the pragmatic wing of the Iranian elite that said, we've got to solve this problem. We've got to get the economy moving. In order to do that, we've got to get the sanctions lifted. In order to do that, we've got to come to a resolution of this nuclear program.
So, Joe and I agree on the first part, perhaps a disagreement on the second part. Without a doubt, the sanctions put a tremendous amount of pressure on the Iranians. Joe listed the statistics. It is a big portion as to why the Iranian economy was doing so badly. And the sanctions were aimed at creating leverage for the United States in a future negotiation from the White House's perspective. From the congressional perspective and those who actually designed the sanctions were supposed to make sure that they never got lifted and that this was an instrument of permanent containment of Iran. That's why they were so against the deal. They didn't want to get these sanctions lifted, and they were very upset that Obama had figured out a way to get them lifted, although that hasn't happened yet. However, here's a couple of things that I think are important to keep in mind, particularly when we think of this as a model of how to deal with future conflicts of this kind. While the US and the EU put all of these really tough sanctions on the Iranians and really added leverage to the US, to the Western side, and really put pressure on the Iranians, what did the Iranians do? Well, they actually did exactly the same game. They were part of the same escalatory cycle, and they accelerated everything that the West wanted Iran to stop doing. So the Iranians had 8,000 centrifuges when Obama came into office. By the time the negotiations got serious, the Iranians had 22,000 centrifuges. They had 1,500 kilos of LEU in 2009. 1,200 is needed in order to build the bomb. They had more than 10,000 by the time negotiations got serious. They had 20% enriched uranium in 2009, and they had 193 or 95 by the time negotiations got serious. If you remember that cartoon picture that Netanyahu brought to the UN, and he's showing a bomb in a red line, the red line is 250 kilos of LEU, of 20% enriched uranium. The Iranians had 190 or 93 at the time. All of this added leverage to the Iranian side. And one of the things that did happen was that folks at the White House recognized that while they still liked their sanctions, the sanctions clock was not working as fast as the Iranian nuclear clock. If these two clocks were just continuing to go forward and there had not been an exit to go back to the table, in which both sides went back to the table, the Iranians were going to get a de facto nuclear bomb faster than the West could cripple and completely collapse the Iranian economy. So an exit was needed. In some ways, the sanctions worked because they proved that sanctions don't work. That you had to be able to find a diplomatic out for this. And if you take a look at it from a larger perspective, of seeing this not as a process of the last 2 or 3 years, but a process of the last 15 years of negotiations, we have to ask ourselves, what is the alternative cost that we're paying when we're pursuing one specific policy, in this case, or in most cases, when we're pursuing a coercive policy, which is what sanctions is? Well, in 2005, the Iranians sent their last negotiation offer to the EU3. At the time, the US was not at the table because the Bush administration felt that if they talked to the Iranians, they would legitimize the Iranians. So the US was not part of the negotiations. March 2005, the last proposal is sent. It's actually done by Zarif, who was then the UN ambassador of Iran. The proposal is public. You can go and look it up. The Iranians offered then to cut their nuclear program at 3,000 centrifuges. They had 8,000 by the time Obama came into office, and this deal leaves them with 6,000, twice as many as they were ready to settle for in 2005 before any of these sanctions. Now, we can still recognize that sanctions do provide a tactical tool, which at the end of the day, in most negotiations, you need to have a coercive element as well. But I think we have made a mistake of thinking of the coercive tool as the center of the strategy and the thing that opened things up in the negotiations. Because it makes perfect sense politically, because you want to go out and you want to brag about how tough you've been, but it's not necessarily what made this thing work. And I think going forward for future cases, it would be good to have a more comprehensive view of what the specific utility and what the specific cost of all of these different tools have been. Because I know I was in the White House for one of these briefings, and the 2005 proposal came up, And the lead negotiator from the US side, or one of the lead negotiators from the US side, said, we would jump on that proposal if we could get that today. That would be awesome. That's 10 years later. After 10 years of coercive policies, we were dreaming about the proposals the Iranians were sending us 10 years ago. We have to keep that in mind.
Okay. Go ahead.
A question on the ABM treaty in 2002 and also 9/11, because it was after 9/11 that Iraq and Iran were both branded the axis of evil by Bush. That was then used for his pulling out of the ABM treaty in 2002 and then ringing Russia with ballistic missile defense systems. Obama then said that he wanted to pull out of pull those BMD systems out after the Iran deal, and subsequently did not do that. In fact, Putin basically said that this was it was a lie to set up these BMD systems that still remain. Yet 9/11, by the indications of former Senator Bob Graham, who was on the 9/11 Commission, he says that it's the Saudis behind 9/11. These are now our great allies in the attempt to overthrow the Syrian government, run into a geopolitical confrontation with Russia, and yet Putin's saying, you know, it just seems to me there's larger geopolitical interests, but perhaps if we got to the core of 9/11, we wouldn't be at loggerheads in this form. Is that a clear question at all?
Is that it? I'm not.
I think it's, you want to go first?
No, go.
I think it is a fair question. I don't know if I would agree with everything, but bottom line is we are entangled in various relationships in the Middle East that have become somewhat unhealthy. Some folks were very worried that this deal would lead to some sort of a Iranian-American pact, that the US would give Iran hegemony over the region and there would be some sort of a US-Iran alliance. That's clearly not going to take place. One way of putting it, and I'm stealing this from some folks in Washington, saying this is not about Washington and Tehran getting into bed with each other. But it could be helpful to make sure that Washington gets out of bed with Saudi Arabia. Because that relationship, which should not turn into an enmity, but nevertheless, the dependency that the United States has had on Saudi Arabia, the lack of maneuverability the US has had vis-a-vis Saudi Arabia, is a major problem. It gets back to what we talked earlier on about what's happening in Paris and Beirut and in Sinai and in Zabul in Afghanistan just in the last 10 days or so. If we can't get to the bottom of where the funding for a lot of this is coming, we're not going to get to the bottom of this issue. And a lot of that, not all of it, comes to a few key states in the Persian Gulf who have been far too relaxed when it comes to the flow of money to many of these different groups. And it's creating global problems at this point. And I want to emphasize, it's not about turning Saudi Arabia into an enemy, but an unhealthy relationship is also a bad relationship. It needs to get fixed.
I'll be real quick about this, and then we'll say people are waiting. George H.W. Bush recently criticized Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld, the advisors to his son, George W. Bush. And one of the things he was criticizing was their ideology, that is, their view of the world. And he believes they had much too much influence over his son and led to this historic blunder, the invasion of Iraq. And I think it's important for us to understand that this was we did not have to go into Iraq. Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11. As the questioner said, it was Saudi nationals and Egyptian nationals that flew the planes into the Twin Towers and into the Pentagon. There was no weapons of mass destruction. I spent a big part of my life investigating that. There was nothing. There was no relationship between al-Qaeda and Saddam Hussein. But those issues were used by a certain sector of the foreign policy elite to justify an action they wanted to take for other reasons. And you still see this element in American politics now, in the American foreign policy debate, the view that we can use American military might as the leading edge of U.S. national security and foreign policy strategy, that we can use our military might to bring about a geopolitical transformation of the Middle East. The idea behind the invasion of Iraq was that that's where we were going to begin this transformation. We were going to do serial regime change, transforming one country after the other and putting in place pro-American democracies. It was an utter disaster, a complete fantasy. And what I see in the Obama administration is not really an ideological pole to that. I see a pragmatic policy that recognizes the limits of American military might, that recognizes a different role that we have in the world today, that we're not the world's cop. We can't go in and solve any problem, that there are going to be tragedies that are going to unfold that there is no quick fix to. And this debate is still happening. It's still ripping through our national security establishment, and whether you're reading Foreign Affairs or you're watching the Republican and Democratic debates. Pay attention to this debate. It's not over yet.
Yes.
First, on that note, would you both advocate taking down the BMD system? And are either of you aware or knowledgeable of a color revolution being planned against the Shiite clergy now that the sanctions have been lifted?
Okay. The first one, we're talking about ballistic missile defense. Yeah. That's the other question, too. So I spent a good part of my life investigating ballistic missile defenses. I did this when I was on the House Armed Services Committee staff. I spent almost a year looking at the performance of the Patriot missile in the Gulf War. You can build a ballistic missile defense that can be effective against short-range missiles like Scuds. The Patriot was not, but we've perfected those systems since. You can shoot down a short-range missile. We have no reliable way of shooting down a long-range ballistic missile. That is something that's flying more than 2,000, 3,000 kilometers, that's entering outer space and coming back in because of the discrimination problem. We actually have interceptors that can hit a bullet with a bullet. We can do this. It's a remarkable technological achievement as long as you can find the bullet. And the problem is that once you're in outer space, you can have a variety of cheap countermeasures, decoys, balloons, little pieces of wire, chaff, low-watt jammers that can block your sensors so you can't see it. And all of the ballistic missile tests we conduct are conducted without the presence of countermeasures of any significance. And so you can't see it. So this idea, and again, it's this ideological view that we have to rely on U.S. military might to defeat the ballistic missile threats, is also, in my view, a fantasy and has greatly complicated our foreign policy, including with Russia. We put in ballistic missile defenses in Europe that we say were aimed at countering an Iranian missile threat that don't work that well, that can't actually counter that threat, but as a result, we greatly complicated our relations with Russia, who viewed those missile defenses as a threat to them. Now, I think they exaggerated it. I think they were using it for their own purposes, but the fact is, this unnecessary and poorly functioning technology has made our defenses weaker because they've hurt some of the relationships that could have led to nuclear reductions in these past 10 years. So yes, I think there is no longer a need for those missile systems in Europe. I think we should take them out. I think it's only politics that's keeping them there.
I'm going to have to apologize. This might have to be the last question, please.
Well, if you turn out to want to answer some other question, that's okay. I just want you to say something about Pakistan and its nuclear capabilities with respect to any kind of interest that Iran might seriously have in continuing to have a nuclear capability. Does Pakistan weigh in here?
Why don't I very briefly take these two questions so then each of our guests can speak. Just take the questions and we'll answer all of them.
I'll try to be very quick. I want to return to the issue of inspections because obviously no matter how good the agreement is, if it can't be verified, it's useless. So you started, Joe, with the things we hear. Here's the things I hear, and I guess I'd like you to either dispel them or correct them. self-inspections, no anytime, anywhere access, sites off limits, and then I'd like you to expand on this 24-day, because what I heard you in your previous answer say, if you bicker back and forth and you don't come to agreement, it goes to Security Council, they pass resolutions.
Okay.
That sounds like business as usual. There's
Okay.
all kinds of resolutions that go nowhere for years. So
We got
what's
it,
better?
yeah. Okay. So why don't I get the other question too, and then I'll.
My question is so
focus.
simple. And how does this agreement affect the relationship between the U.S. and Saudi or Israel?
I didn't understand.
Can you repeat it again?
Say one more
How
time.
this agreement affect the relationship between the U.S. and Saudi and Israel?
So you said Saudi relations. Okay, so we have Pakistan, we have inspections, and we have
Real
the
quick,
U.S.-Saudi
one
relations.
thing to
So
keep
each
in
one-
mind is although the International Atomic Energy Agency is conducting the inspections, and they're the international agency that you have to have in order to set up this kind of system where one country lets inspectors in to look at their sensitive equipment, that's not the only tool we have. Iran is probably the most watched country on earth. We have penetrated very deeply into the Iranian nuclear program with our intelligence assets. So have the Israelis, so have the French, so have the Germans. We know a lot about the Iranian nuclear program. There are not a lot of secrets about what they're doing and what's going on. The inspection procedures are stronger in this agreement than any other inspection regime ever negotiated. A lot of us in the nonproliferation world want to use this as a model for what other countries should do. That's how good they are. They're not weaker, they're stronger in every instance. Self-inspection procedures, there's a certain kind of inspection where you're in very sensitive sites that is followed in countries all around the world, where the other side is allowed to have their people take the swipes, take the sample. That's what's going on in Iran. They take a swipe like you do at the airport and put it in a sealed bag under cameras, under videos, and then give that to the IAEA inspector. That's the kind of thing that's been called self-inspection, because you have an Iranian doing it in some cases instead of an IAE. There's other things I'll be happy to talk to you afterhand. Pakistan, you want to know about a nuclear threat, a problem program? Pakistan is a living nuclear nightmare. It is a disaster waiting to happen. Iran isn't even close to the kind of threat that Pakistan's nuclear program presents to us. I don't think the Pakistan program is influencing now, currently, any Iranian ideas about whether they should continue their nuclear program or not.
If I could pick up where Joe ended on Pakistan. Pakistan has not been a motivator for the Iranian nuclear program in any way, shape, or form. In fact, the threat that comes from Pakistan is the disintegration of Pakistan, the collapse of the Pakistani state, and the fact that those nuclear weapons could end up in the hands of organizations, terrorist organizations, etc., who you cannot deter with your own nuclear capacity anyways. What has motivated the Iranian nuclear program was actually Saddam Hussein. There's no coincidence that the Iranians ended some of these alleged experiments in 2003 when Saddam was taken out. And the reason for this is that when the Iraq-Iran war ended in 1988, it was a very, very fragile peace. And both sides were convinced that the peace would not last. And both sides were convinced that the other side would not be able to bear the cost that this 8-year-long war had inflicted on them again. So as a result, both sides thought that the other side would use weapons of mass destruction in the early phases of the next war in order to make sure that it didn't drag on for another 8 years. And that's what was motivating the Iranians, because the Iranians were catching up to Saddam, because Saddam had much more of an advanced program than the Iranians had at all. The Iranians had a program that they froze during most of the 1980s, and then they reignited it. And that was what kept the Iranians focused on a nuclear capability. Incidentally, we also know now, based on the interviews that were done with Saddam after he was caught, that part of the reason why Saddam gave the impression that he had a nuclear weapons program and didn't want to be completely transparent about the fact that he actually didn't was because he didn't want the Iranians to know that he didn't have it. So while we in Washington constantly felt that, the world is surrounding around us, whatever the Iranians do is because of the United States and their calculations vis-a-vis the United States, the Iranians and the Iraqis were obsessing about each other. And once the Iraqi nuclear threat was gone, some of the motivations for the Iranians to pursue that option also dissipated as a result.
So, to come to the end of our program, I want to thank both of you for spending this time with us, and thank you all for coming and for your questions.